To the world, they were polar opposites. Anthony Perkins, the brooding actor destined to become the terrifying Norman Bates, and Tab Hunter, the wholesome all-American golden boy. While magazines painted them as rivals, fighting for the same women and studios sold them as heterosexual dreams, the reality hidden behind the walls of the Chateau Marmont in 1956 was far different. These two men were lovers, risking prison and their careers for a romance that became Hollywood's greatest deception. In the 1950s, a Hollywood studio operated less like a business and more like a feudal system. When a young actor signed a standard 7-year contract with Warner Brothers or Paramount, they effectively signed away their autonomy. The document was absolute. The studio determined every aspect of their existence, from the movies they filmed to the clothes they wore and even the people they were allowed to see. Tab Hunter did not exist on a birth certificate. He was an invention of the boardroom, created because Arthur Kelm didn't sound like a movie star. To executives like the formidable Jack Warner, actors were viewed primarily as high-value assets, livestock to be developed, marketed, and sold for a profit. Like any expensive asset, they had to be protected from damage. This protection came with a terrifying legal weapon, the morals clause. Buried deep within every contract was a paragraph that gave the studio the power to fire an actor immediately if they committed any act of moral turpitude or brought the studio into public disrepute. The language was intentionally vague. It was a catch-all trap designed to police the private lives of the stars. In the conservative climate of 1950s America, moral turpitude was a code word. It covered adultery, divorce, and political radicalism, but its primary unspoken target was homosexuality. For Tab Hunter, Warner Brothers was a golden prison. The studio paid for his singing lessons, his gym memberships, and his wardrobe, but they made it clear that this investment was a loan, not a gift. If he stepped out of line, the machine that built him would instantly dismantle him. He would not just lose his job, he would lose the very identity the world had come to love. Anthony Perkins faced the same reality at Paramount. The studio had curated his image as the sensitive intellectual, but that image was fragile. Executives monitored his public appearances and scrutinized his interviews. They needed him to be eccentric, but not too eccentric. The power dynamic was total. The studios kept private detectives on their payrolls and maintained informants in the LAPD. They knew who went into which bar and who woke up in whose bed. They knew about Tony and Tab long before the public ever suspected a thing. Yet the studios did not fire them. As long as the movies were making money, the executives were willing to look the other way. They used the information not to punish, but to control. The knowledge of their secret relationship became leverage, a silent threat that kept Tony and Tab obedient, working harder and smiling brighter. They were allowed to be stars only as long as they remembered they were property first. Outside the protective walls of the studio lots, the atmosphere was even more poisonous. While the movie moguls worried about box office receipts, the United States government was engaged in a systematic purge of its own citizens. History remembers the 1950s for Senator Joseph McCarthy and his hunt for communists, known as the Red Scare. But running parallel to it, and often more vicious, was the Lavender Scare. In 1953, President Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10,450. This decree declared that sexual perversion was grounds for immediate dismissal from federal employment. The logic was cold and circular. Homosexuals had secrets. Therefore, they could be blackmailed by foreign enemies. Therefore, they were security risks. Thousands of men and women lost their jobs, their pensions, and their reputations, not because they had committed espionage, but because of who they loved. The government had effectively declared open season on the private lives of Americans. This state-sanctioned paranoia filtered down to the streets of Los Angeles. The LAPD operated aggressive vice squads dedicated to entrapping gay men. Plainclothes officers frequented bars, public parks, and even restrooms, posing as interested partners. A lingering glance or a private conversation could result in handcuffs, a mugshot, and a name printed in the morning papers. A conviction meant not only jail time, but often forced registration as a sex offender or involuntary commitment to a psychiatric institution for curing. For Anthony Perkins and Tab Hunter, this was the air they breathed. Every time they left their homes, they entered a minefield. A speeding ticket was not just a traffic violation. It was an opportunity for a police officer to look inside the car, see two famous men together, and ask dangerous questions. The fear was physical. It lived in the tightness of the chest and the constant scanning of a room before speaking. They were celebrities, worshipped by millions, yet they possessed fewer civil rights than the average citizen. In this climate, their love was an act of quiet rebellion against a society that viewed their existence as a threat to national security. Before the magazine covers and the screaming fans, there was only Arthur Kelm. Born in New York City in 1931, but raised under the bright sun of California, he was a shy, devoutly Catholic teenager scooping manure at a riding academy. Abandoned by an abusive father and raised by a strict German mother, Arthur sought refuge in the quiet company of horses. Unlike many who flocked to Hollywood, he lacked a burning ambition for the screen or a desperate need for applause. He was simply a good-looking boy trying to survive a lonely childhood. But in Los Angeles, beauty is a currency, and Arthur was sitting on a fortune he didn't know he possessed. The man who came to collect that fortune was Henry Wilson. In the predatory ecosystem of Hollywood agents, Wilson was an apex predator. He specialized in a very specific commodity: young, handsome, malleable men. He wasn't scouting for talent. He was hunting for an aesthetic. Looking at Arthur Kelm, Wilson saw a blank canvas rather than a person. He saw a jawline that could sell tickets and a smile that could sell toothpaste. Wilson went to work immediately. The first casualty was the name. Arthur Kelm was too soft, too ethnic, too ordinary. Wilson brainstormed with the efficiency of a branding consultant. He wanted something punchy, something that sounded like a weapon or a sports car. He landed on tab, slang for a tabulator key, implying something ready to be written on, and hunter for the aggression it implied. In an instant, Arthur Kelm was erased. Tab Hunter was born. The transformation was total. Wilson dictated the haircut, the wardrobe, and the mannerisms. He taught Tab how to walk into a room and how to shake hands like a leading man. Warner Brothers took over where Wilson left off, enrolling their new creation in acting classes and vocal training. They weren't training an artist so much as calibrating a machine. Tab worked tirelessly, driven by a fear of failure and a desire to please his new masters. The result was a perfect synthetic product. The public saw a confident, virile American hero. They saw the Psy guy. But inside the chiseled exterior, Arthur Kelm was still hiding. He viewed Tab Hunter simply as a role he had to play 24 hours a day, speaking of Tab in the third person as if discussing a separate entity. This dissociation was his survival mechanism. The world fell in love with the reflection in the mirror, but the man staring back knew it was just a trick of the light. The boy from the stables was gone, buried under layers of studio gloss, trapped inside the body of a superstar. If Tab Hunter was a creation of the present, forged from sunlight and ambition, Anthony Perkins was a captive of the past. Born in New York City in 1932, he arrived in Hollywood not as a blank slate, but as a young man carrying invisible baggage that no studio publicist could ever fully unpack. He did not need a new name. His name was already a legacy. He was the son of Osgood Perkins, the legendary King of Broadway, a character actor of immense stature whose shadow loomed large long after his death. But Tony was not just the heir to a theatrical throne. He was a survivor of a childhood defined by suffocating intimacy and sudden, devastating loss. The trauma that shaped Anthony Perkins struck when he was just 5 years old. His father died of a heart attack, abruptly vanishing from the boy's life. In the confused, magical thinking of a grieving child, Tony believed he had caused the death through the sheer force of his own jealousy. He had wanted his mother Janet all to himself, and the universe had brutally granted his wish. This guilt festered. It grew into a defining neurosis, a jagged shard of anxiety that lodged itself in his psyche. He grew up in a household devoid of a father figure, raised by a mother whose love was intense, controlling, and overwhelming. He was a frail, sickly child, prone to illnesses that kept him indoors, sharpening a mind that was already dangerously introspective. By the time he reached his 20s, Tony had transformed this inner turmoil into a formidable artistic weapon. He was thin, almost gaunt, with a skeletal elegance that defied the beefcake standards of the era. His eyes were dark pools of intelligence that seemed to see through the camera lens. Paramount Pictures realized they could not market him as a traditional hero. He wasn't the cowboy or the soldier. Instead, they capitalized on the zeitgeist of the mid-1950s, a cultural moment that was beginning to fetishize vulnerability. They branded him as the Prince of Angst. Paramount sold Tony Perkins as the thinking woman's obsession. He was the spiritual successor to James Dean, who had died in 1955, leaving a vacuum for a male star who could cry, tremble, and articulate the confusion of youth. Tony filled that void, but with a sharper, more aristocratic edge. In films like Friendly Persuasion, he projected a nervous, twitchy energy that felt painfully real because it was. Rather than acting the part of a tortured soul, he simply allowed the camera to witness his actual discomfort. The stutter, the hesitation, the way he seemed to shrink away from human contact, these were not affectations. They were the visible symptoms of a man at war with himself. This internal war was fueled by a secret far darker to him than it was to Tab Hunter. For Tab, his sexuality was a dangerous fact of life, something to be managed. For Tony, it was a source of profound, agonizing shame. He wished to do more than simply hide his attraction to men. He wanted to destroy it entirely. He viewed his own desires as a sickness, a defect in his character that barred him from the normalcy he craved. He spent years on the psychiatrist's couch, pouring out his soul to doctors who promised to cure him, reinforcing the idea that he was broken. He threw himself into his work with a monk-like discipline, believing that if he could just become a great enough actor, the applause would drown out the silence of his lonely existence. When he looked at Tab Hunter, Tony saw everything he was not. He saw physical ease, athletic grace, and a simple, unthinking confidence that Tony could only emulate through technique. He envied Tab's ability to simply be in the world, yet beneath the envy was a desperate need for connection. Tony was the solitary intellectual trapped in a tower of his own making, and Tab was the golden light that promised a way out. His attraction to Tab was intense and immediate, driven by the magnetic pull of a man who seemed to possess the very life force that Tony felt he had been denied. Paramount had bought a star, but they had unknowingly signed a tragedy in progress. A young man running as fast as he could from the ghosts of his childhood straight into the arms of an industry that would exploit every single one of his fears. While the studios controlled the contracts, the true dark architect of 1950s beefcake masculinity operated out of a smaller, dimmer office on the Sunset Strip. Henry Wilson, known in the industry shadows as the Leech, had already masterminded the transformation of Arthur Kelm into Tab Hunter and Roy Scherer into Rock Hudson. But Wilson was more than just an agent or a twisted Pygmalion. He was the keeper of secrets. Wilson's genius lay in his ability to monetize the closet. He filled his stable with gay or bisexual men, fully aware that their sexual orientation was a ticking time bomb. He did not fear this liability. He exploited it. Because his clients had secrets that could destroy them, they were entirely dependent on him for protection. However, this protection was transactional. Wilson kept a dossier on everyone in Hollywood, and his office served as a clearinghouse for gossip and blackmail. If a scandal magazine threatened to expose one of his clients, Wilson would not hesitate to barter, trading a lesser star's reputation to save a bigger earner. For Tab Hunter, Wilson was the gateway to the dream, but he was also the jailer. Wilson looked at Tab and saw a masterpiece of engineering, a golden calf he had sculpted from clay, and he expected his creation to remain silent, grateful, and eternally obedient. The true geography of Anthony Perkins and Tab Hunter's relationship was not mapped out in the flashbulb-lit restaurants of Beverly Hills, but on a quiet stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway. In 1957, seeking an escape from the suffocating scrutiny of the city, Tab rented a small, weathered beach house at 22,626 Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu. To the outside world, it was just a bachelor pad for Hollywood's most eligible young star. In reality, it became a fortress of solitude, the only place on earth where the two most photographed men in America could simply exist as human beings. The logistics of their intimacy required the precision of a covert operation. Tony would never arrive while the sun was up. He would wait until darkness fell over the coast, driving his modest Volkswagen Beetle, a car chosen specifically for its anonymity, along the winding ocean roads. He would park not in the driveway, where a passing car might spot the license plate, but tucked away in the shadows of the garage or down the street. The arrival was always a breathless dash from the car to the front door, a momentary exposure to the risk of discovery before the lock clicked shut and the world was finally locked out. Inside the walls of the Malibu house, the armor of celebrity was stripped away. The Prince of Angst and the Golden Boy ceased to exist. In their place were just Tony and Tab. Their time together was defined not by the glamour of Hollywood, but by a desperate hunger for the mundane. They did the things that ordinary couples took for granted, but which for them were illicit luxuries. They cooked simple dinners in a small kitchen, arguing playfully over recipes. They sat on the floor of the living room, listening to records, Tony introducing Tab to the complexities of modern jazz, Tab playing the rock and roll hits that were sweeping the nation. They didn't have to pose. They didn't have to smile. For a few precious hours, they didn't have to be on guard. The beach house offered a sensory refuge. The constant roar of the Pacific Ocean acted as a sonic shield, drowning out the noise of the industry back in town. They could walk on the private stretch of sand at midnight under the cover of a moonless sky, holding hands in a way that would have ended their careers instantly if witnessed by a single lens. It was a domesticity stolen in fragments. They knew that every morning would bring the inevitable separation, the return to the studios, where they would have to pretend to be strangers or mere acquaintances. Yet this sanctuary was fragile. It was an open secret among the Hollywood elite, a whisper network of trusted friends who knew the truth but kept the code of silence. Visitors like Venetia Stevenson or the ever-loyal Natalie Wood would drop by, creating a protective buffer of social plausibility. But the threat was always there, lurking just beyond the driveway. A delivery man, a stray fan, or a persistent paparazzo could shatter their world at any moment. They lived in a state of heightened alertness, where a ringing telephone could signal disaster. But in the quiet of those Malibu nights, with the ocean wind rattling the windows, they managed to carve out a pocket of reality in a life built on illusions. It was here, in the dark, that they were most truly themselves. While Tony and Tab built their private world in the shadows of Malibu, the studios were busy constructing the public facade that would hide it. The cornerstone of this deception was the beard, a term of Hollywood insider slang for a woman who publicly dated a gay man to shield his sexual orientation. But to dismiss these women merely as props would be a disservice to the complex, often compassionate roles they played in this high-stakes theater. More than just camouflage, these women were often collaborators and friends, fellow participants in a system that demanded performance above all else. For Tab Hunter, the primary accomplice in this deception was Natalie Wood. She was petite, dark-haired, and radiantly beautiful, the perfect visual counterpoint to Tab's towering blonde athleticism. To the fan magazines, they were young Hollywood royalty, a match made in heaven. In reality, they were a match made in the boardroom of Warner Brothers. They shared the same agent, the same pressures, and the same cynical understanding of the game. Yet, their relationship was far from cold. Natalie knew the truth about Tab from the beginning. She didn't judge him, she adored him. She was a guy's girl, sharp-witted and fiercely loyal, who saw in Tab a kindred spirit navigating the treacherous waters of fame. Their dates were masterpieces of choreography. A studio limousine would collect them, delivering them to the red carpet of a premiere or the entrance of Kiro's nightclub at the precise moment the photographers were assembled. They would smile, hold hands, and gaze into each other's eyes with practiced adoration. The flashbulbs would erupt, capturing the image that would be splashed across the next morning's papers. Once inside, away from the cameras, the performance would drop. They would laugh, gossip, and talk shop like the best friends they were. Natalie was Tab's shield, deflecting the rumors with her sheer star power. She knowingly used her own fame to protect his, a profound act of platonic love in an industry devoid of genuine empathy. Anthony Perkins' public life was managed with similar calculation, often paired with actresses like Venetia Stevenson or the French dancer Zizi Jeanmaire. Paramount crafted narratives of intellectual romances, suggesting that Tony's relationships were deep, artistic unions rather than the fiery flings of the teen idols. These women were often aspiring actresses themselves, and being seen on the arm of Anthony Perkins was a career boost, a mutually beneficial arrangement where visibility was the currency. Tony, however, found the charade more exhausting than Tab. While Tab could breeze through a fake date with a dazzling smile, Tony often appeared awkward and detached, his discomfort reading as the brooding intensity that was his trademark. The studio publicists were the directors of these real-life plays. They scripted the anecdotes the couple would tell the press, coordinated their outfits, and even staged candid photos of them sharing milkshakes or walking on the beach. It was a relentless, grinding job. For Tony and Tab, every public outing was a workday. They had to be constantly vigilant, ensuring no slip of the tongue or wandering eye betrayed their true nature. The psychological toll was immense. They were forcing themselves to perform intimacy with women they respected but did not desire, all while knowing that the person they truly loved was often just a few miles away, equally trapped in another staged romance. It was a bizarre, lonely dance, performed under the brightest lights, designed to convince the world of a lie so they could keep the truth for themselves. The true predator of 1950s Hollywood was not a person, but a publication. Confidential magazine printed on cheap paper with screaming red and yellow headlines, outsold Time and TV Guide. Publisher Robert Harrison had industrialized the business of scandal. He did not rely on idle gossip. He operated a private intelligence agency. He employed a vast network of hotel maids, disgruntled limousine drivers, switchboard operators, and corrupt vice squad officers paid to search trash cans, listen to phone calls, and steal medical records. Confidential did not just report news, they conducted assassinations. For a closeted actor, a single paragraph in its pages was not merely bad press. It was a professional execution. By 1955, the magazine had gathered enough nuclear material to destroy the entire beefcake industry. Their primary target was the biggest star of them all, Rock Hudson. They possessed irrefutable evidence of his homosexuality and threatened to publish a story detailing his secret life. This was the nightmare scenario for Henry Wilson. Rock Hudson was not just a client. He was Wilson's masterpiece, the primary source of his agency's revenue. If Rock fell, the empire crumbled. Cornered and desperate, Wilson made a decision that revealed the absolute moral bankruptcy of the system. He requested a clandestine meeting with the editors of Confidential. In a smoky backroom deal that resembled a mafia sit-down, Wilson offered a blood sacrifice. To save Rock Hudson, he agreed to feed 2 of his other clients to the wolves. He handed over the dossier on Rory Calhoun, revealing his hidden past as an armed robber and federal prisoner. It was a cold, utilitarian calculation. Sacrifice the pawn to save the king. The magazine's appetite remained insatiable. Even after the Calhoun trade, they turned their sights on Tab Hunter. Their investigators dug deep into the archives of the Los Angeles Police Department and unearthed a buried incident from October 1950. 5 years prior, long before he was a star, a teenage Tab Hunter had been arrested at a private home on Ellendale Place during a police raid on a pajama party. The charge was disorderly conduct, a legal euphemism often used to police gay gatherings. The police report was damning, listing the names of the men arrested and describing the nature of the party in lurid detail. In September 1955, the story hit the stands. The headline was a masterpiece of innuendo. The lowdown on that disorderly conduct charge against Tab Hunter. The article used dog whistle language, describing the party as limp-wristed and implying the men were wearing women's clothing. It was a direct attempt to shatter the boy next door image Warner Brothers had spent millions to construct. In any previous era, or for any lesser star, this would have been the end. The morals clause would have been invoked immediately, the contract terminated, and Tab Hunter would have been cast out into oblivion. Inside the executive offices of Warner Brothers, however, a different calculation took place. The studio heads, led by the ruthless Jack Warner, looked at the accounting books. Tab Hunter was not just an actor, he was a vertical industry. His movies were number 1. His records were topping the Billboard charts. He was generating revenue streams that were propping up the studio during a difficult financial year. They decided that Tab Hunter was simply too profitable to fail. The Warner Brothers PR machine, a formidable engine of propaganda, swung into action. They did not apologize. They did not explain. They attacked. They dismissed Confidential as a rag-peddling filth and lies. Simultaneously, they accelerated the heterosexual offensive. They flooded the fan magazines with exclusive spreads of Tab, lifting weights, playing with his dogs, and discussing the kind of wife he wanted to marry. They saturated the market with so much wholesome imagery that the scandal was drowned out by the sheer volume of good news. The gamble paid off. The general public, largely naive and desperate to believe in the fantasy, chose to ignore the scandal. Tab Hunter survived, walking through the fire with his career intact, but the victory was ashes in his mouth. The near miss shattered his innocence forever. He realized with chilling clarity that his survival had nothing to do with loyalty, friendship, or justice. Warner Brothers had not saved him because they cared about Arthur Kelm. They saved him because Tab Hunter was an asset with value on the books. He saw the strings of the puppet master for the first time. Henry Wilson was capable of trading him like a poker chip, and the studio viewed him not as a human being, but as property. He was safe, but he was more owned than ever before. The fear of exposure did not vanish. It simply burrowed deeper, becoming the background radiation of his entire existence. The true poison in the relationship between Anthony Perkins and Tab Hunter was not brewed in a police station or a magazine office. It was distilled in the quiet, intimate moments between them. The industry that owned them had done its job too well. It had categorized them so rigidly, Tony as the genius, Tab as the beauty, that they began to view each other not just as lovers, but as mirrors reflecting their own deepest insecurities. The external threats of the tabloids and the vice squads were terrifying, but they united the couple against a common enemy. The internal threat, however, was far more insidious because it turned them against themselves. Anthony Perkins looked at Tab Hunter and saw the one thing he believed he could never be: a traditional movie star. Tony was consumed by a crippling dysmorphia. When he looked in the mirror, he did not see the sensitive, handsome face that millions of women adored. He saw a lanky, awkward collection of sharp angles. He saw a chest that was too hollow, shoulders that were too narrow, and a posture that was perpetually defensive. He envied Tab's effortless physicality, the golden hair, the symmetrical jawline, the way Tab filled a room simply by standing in it. Tony would watch Tab move with a mixture of desire and a painful, corroding jealousy. He wanted to be the American ideal, the hero who gets the girl and saves the day, but his studio masters kept casting him as the nervous, neurotic outsider. He felt defective in the presence of Tab's perfection, a shadow standing next to the sun. Tab Hunter, conversely, looked at Tony and saw the artistic legitimacy he was starving for. Tab was painfully aware of his own reputation as a product. He knew the critics dismissed him as a vacuous pretty boy, a singing mannequin propped up by the Warner Brothers marketing machine. He hated the shirtless photo shoots. He hated the bubblegum pop songs he was forced to record. He yearned to be taken seriously, to sink his teeth into a role that required sweat and tears rather than just a smile. He watched Tony prepare for roles with a sense of awe. He saw the way Tony deconstructed a script, the way he used his entire body as an instrument of emotion, and the way the industry respected him as a craftsman. Tab didn't want to be the side guy. He wanted to be an actor. He wanted the respect that Tony commanded effortlessly. This mutual envy created a strange, suffocating tension in the Malibu beach house. Their love was real, but it was laced with the bitterness of what they lacked. They were two halves of the perfect Hollywood man, beauty and brains, but they were trapped in separate bodies. The industry exacerbated this dynamic by constantly pitting them against each other in the press, but in private, the competition was unspoken. It manifested in small silences, in the way Tony would critique Tab's acting a little too sharply, or the way Tab would boast about his box office numbers a little too loudly. They were sleeping with the personification of their own inadequacies. The dynamic was sustainable only as long as their careers ran on parallel tracks. Tony in his prestige dramas, Tab in his commercial blockbusters. But the studio system was shrinking, and the walls were closing in. The distinct lanes they occupied were beginning to merge. They were both young, they were both ambitious, and they were both fighting for survival in a town that had no loyalty. Soon, they would not just be lovers envying each other from afar. They would be direct competitors fighting for the same scrap of meat. The professional jealousy that had been a low hum in the background was about to become a scream. The psychological fault lines in the relationship finally ruptured over a bound stack of paper. The script for Fear Strikes Out. The film was to be a biopic of Jimmy Pearsall, the Boston Red Sox outfielder who had suffered a highly public nervous breakdown on the field. The story was raw, demanding, and utterly devoid of the glamour usually associated with Hollywood biographies. It centered on a young man crushed by the weight of his father's tyrannical expectations and the relentless pressure to perform a masculinity he did not feel. For any young actor in 1957, it was a career-defining opportunity. For Tab Hunter, it was something far more profound. It was an exorcism. Tab had already lived inside the skin of Jimmy Pearsall. A year prior, he had starred in a live television version of the story for the anthology series Climax. It remained the finest, most honest work of his career. For 60 Minutes on live TV, Tab had stripped away the Psy Guy persona. He stopped smiling. He wept, he screamed, and he projected a vulnerability that shocked the critics who had dismissed him as a vacuous pretty boy. Tab identified with Pearsall on a cellular level. He understood what it meant to perform for a crowd while slowly cracking on the inside. He understood the suffocating pressure of a father figure, or, in his case, a studio system, that demanded absolute obedience. He believed, with a desperate religious certainty, that the feature film version of Fear Strikes Out was his destiny. It was the vehicle that would finally transport him from the beefcake ghetto to the ranks of serious artists. Tab lobbied Warner Brothers furiously. He begged Jack Warner to loan him out to Paramount for the picture. He argued that he had already proven he could play the role. He was willing to defer his salary, willing to work for scale, willing to do anything to secure the part. But Warner Brothers was a factory, not an art school. They saw no profit in Tab Hunter playing a mental patient. They wanted him in musicals, in light comedies, in beach movies where his shirt could come off. They stalled, they hesitated, and they effectively blocked his path. While Tab was fighting his own studio, Anthony Perkins was watching from the sidelines, and then he made his move. Tony saw the same script and recognized the same potential. He saw a character that fit his Prince of Angst brand perfectly, a twitchy, neurotic, tortured soul. Tony knew that Tab considered this role his property. He had watched Tab's television performance. He knew how much blood Tab had left on the floor for that role. In a relationship defined by loyalty or even basic human empathy, Tony would have stepped back. He would have respected his partner's claim to the material, or at least refused to actively campaign against him. Instead, Anthony Perkins went for the jugular. Driven by an ambition that superseded any romantic allegiance, Tony pursued the role aggressively. He used his leverage as Paramount's rising star to block outsiders. He aligned himself with the director Robert Mulligan and the producer Alan Pakula, convincing them that the film required a serious actor, not a pop star, from Warner Brothers. Tony didn't just compete for the role. He actively delegitimized Tab's ability to play it. He leveraged the very stereotypes that Tab was trying to escape, reinforcing the idea that Tab was just a pretty face, while he, Tony, was the true artist. It was a ruthless, calculated maneuver executed with the cold precision of a man who believed that art was more important than people. When Paramount announced that Anthony Perkins had been cast as Jimmy Pearsall, the atmosphere in the Malibu beach house turned glacial. For Tab, this represented an intimate betrayal far deeper than professional disappointment. The man he loved had used his superior position in the industry to steal his dream. He had to watch as Tony went to work every day, inhabiting the skin of the character that Tab felt belonged to him. He had to listen to Tony discuss the complexities of the role over dinner, oblivious or indifferent to the pain he was inflicting. Tony delivered a brilliant performance in the film. He twitched and trembled his way to critical acclaim, solidifying his status as the heir to James Dean. But every accolade Tony received felt like a physical blow to Tab. The release of Fear Strikes Out in 1957 marked the spiritual end of their relationship. They remained together for a while longer, going through the motions of their secret life, but the trust had been incinerated. Tab realized that for Tony, the applause of the audience would always be louder than the quiet intimacy of their life together. Tony had chosen the studio over the lover. He had proven that in the Darwinian ecosystem of Hollywood, he was willing to cannibalize his own heart to feed his career. The resentment settled into the foundation of their romance like rot, turning their sanctuary into a cold, silent war zone. The love affair didn't end with a shout. It ended with a casting call. By the time 1959 arrived, the air inside the Malibu beach house had become too thin to breathe. The end of the relationship between Anthony Perkins and Tab Hunter did not arrive with the violent crash of a scandal, nor with the dramatic screaming matches that characterized the films they starred in. There were no thrown vases, no tears shed on the front pages of the tabloids. Instead, their love died the quiet, suffocating death of a romance starved of oxygen. The sheer logistical weight of living a double life for 3 years had finally crushed them. The adrenaline that had once fueled their affair, the thrill of the stolen glances, the midnight drives, the secret codes, had curdled into a grinding gray exhaustion. The fear of discovery, once a spice that added danger to their passion, had become a heavy leaden blanket that smothered any chance of joy. The physical separation forced upon them by the studios played a decisive role in this erosion. As their careers expanded, their geographies diverged. Tony was increasingly pulled toward the East Coast, to the Broadway stages and the serious acting circles of New York. He was filming projects like Green Mansions, spending months on location, isolated and moody. Tab was anchored in Los Angeles or shipped off to distant locations for Warner Brothers productions. The telephone became their primary lifeline. But in 1959, the telephone was a dangerous instrument. They could not speak freely. They could not say, "I love you" or "I miss you," without the paranoid fear that a switchboard operator or a private detective was listening on the line. Their conversations became cryptic, brief, and emotionally hollow. The silence between them grew, filling the space where intimacy used to live. More corrosive than the distance was the intellectual and social divergence occurring within their minds. Anthony Perkins was undergoing a profound internal transformation, one that pushed him away from Tab. Tony had fallen under the spell of the heavy intellectual culture of New York method acting, and more destructively, Freudian psychoanalysis. He began to view his homosexuality not as a trait, but as a pathology, a sickness that needed to be analyzed, dissected, and ultimately cured. He surrounded himself with a sophisticated, cynical crowd that looked down on the commercial fluff of Hollywood. Through this new lens, Tab Hunter, with his pop songs, his fan magazines, and his sunny disposition, appeared unsophisticated. Tony began to treat Tab with a subtle intellectual condescension, a coolness that suggested Tab was part of the problem Tony was trying to solve. Tab, sensitive and intuitive, felt this judgment acutely. He was already fighting a war for his own professional survival as the studio system began to wobble, and his box office dominance faded. He needed a partner who provided a sanctuary, a safe harbor from the critics who dismissed him as a pretty face. Instead, he found Tony increasingly distant, critical, and wrapped in a layer of neurosis that Tab could no longer penetrate. The warmth of the golden boy could no longer melt the ice that Tony was building around his heart. The sexual chemistry that had brought them together at the Chateau Marmont was replaced by a polite, painful awkwardness. They were no longer lovers sharing a secret. They were strangers sharing a secret. The fiction they were forced to live finally consumed the reality they were trying to protect. The beards, the fake girlfriends, the stage premieres, the endless parade of photographers were no longer just an annoying necessity. They became the primary architecture of their lives. Tony was photographed so often with women, and Tab was so inextricably linked with Natalie Wood in the public imagination that the lie began to feel more substantial than the truth. The mask had eaten the face. When they did manage to steal a night together at the beach house, it felt like an interruption of their real lives, rather than the center of it. The effort required to drop the act, to stop performing, became too great. They would return to the beach house, drained, sitting in the dark, with nothing left to give each other but silence. Tab later described the end with a heartbreaking simplicity, saying they had outgrown each other. But this was a gentle euphemism for a harsher reality. The truth was that the industry had successfully driven a wedge between them. The studios had manufactured two distinct products, the brooding genius and the sunny heartthrob, and those products could no longer share the same shelf. The separation was undramatic because the passion had been siphoned off, drop by drop, by the stress of the closet. One day the bags were simply packed, the keys to the beach house were returned. There was no final speech. They drifted apart with the inevitability of a tide going out. They retreated back into the safety of their solitary confinements, back to the agents and the adoring fans who knew nothing of their hearts. The Hollywood machine had won. It had proven that in the factory of dreams there was no production line for a love like theirs. They walked away, leaving the beach house to the sound of the ocean and the ghosts of a life they were not allowed to live. In 1960, 1 year after the silence fell over the Malibu beach house, Anthony Perkins walked onto a soundstage at Universal Studios and stepped into a shower that would wash away the rest of his life. The film was Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. The role was Norman Bates, the shy, stuttering motel owner with a dark secret and a dead mother in the fruit cellar. For Tony, this was not merely an acting job, it was a collision with destiny. Alfred Hitchcock, a director with a cruel genius for exploiting his actors' vulnerabilities, saw something in Tony. The nervous twitch, the boyish charm masking a deep unease, the skeletal tension in his shoulders, and amplified it for the screen. Hitchcock didn't just direct Anthony Perkins, he mined him. He extracted the actor's own anxieties and splashed them across the screen in black and white. When Psycho was released, it shattered box office records and changed the grammar of cinema forever. But for Anthony Perkins, the victory was a prison sentence. The public, terrified and fascinated, could no longer distinguish the actor from the character. To the world, Tony was Norman Bates. The role fit him so perfectly that it became a straitjacket. The sensitive romantic lead of the 1950s, the boy who could have been the next James Dean, was erased instantly. He was replaced by the creepy loner, the archetype of the murderous deviant. But the tragedy went deeper than typecasting. Norman Bates was a man destroyed by his own secrets, a man warped by a suffocating relationship with his mother, a man who could not connect with women sexually. The parallels to Tony's own life, his fatherless childhood, his intense and domineering mother Janet, his hidden homosexuality, were so precise they were agonizing. He had revealed his own shadow to the world, and the world had recoiled in horror. He felt flayed alive, terrified by this exposure and driven by the homophobic dogma of the era. Tony declared war on his own nature. He did not accept his sexuality. He attacked it with the ferocity of a man trying to cut out a tumor. He threw himself into the brutal machinery of 1960s psychoanalysis, spending countless hours and small fortunes on doctors who promised to cure him. This was not therapy for comfort. It was conversion. He viewed his attraction to men not as love, but as a compulsion, a defect in the machinery of his soul that needed to be repaired. He cut himself off from his past, distancing himself from former lovers like Tab Hunter, as if they were carriers of a contagion he was trying to survive. He lived a life of rigorous, punishing denial, chasing a heteronormative ideal that always remained just out of reach. He wanted to be normal. He wanted to be the man the studio had pretended he was. In 1973, at the age of 41, he made his final desperate bid for that normalcy. He met Barry Berenson, a photographer and actress from a legendary bohemian family, the granddaughter of fashion designer Elsa Schiaparelli and sister of Marisa Berenson. Barry was everything Tony was not: free-spirited, aristocratic, fiercely open-hearted, and unafraid of the dark. She knew the rumors about Tony. She knew his history. She didn't care. She fell in love with his gentleness. They married, and for the first time in his life, Tony found a sanctuary that didn't require a lock on the door. By all accounts, the marriage was not a cynical sham in the traditional Hollywood sense. Tony genuinely loved Barry. She brought light into his darkened room. They had 2 sons, Osgood and Elvis, and created a family life on Cape Cod that looked from the outside like the happy ending he had always been denied. But the cure was a mirage. The shadow of his past never truly lifted. He remained a man divided, loving his wife and children deeply while still haunted by the desires he had spent a lifetime suppressing. He continued to have secretive encounters with men driven by a hunger that domesticity could not sate, followed by crushing waves of guilt. Then the final act of his life was written by the plague that decimated his generation. When the AIDS crisis swept through the gay community in the 1980s, Tony watched in silence as friends and former colleagues vanished. He lived in terror that his past would catch up to him. In 1990 it did. He was diagnosed with HIV, likely contracted during those secretive years of treatment and denial. True to the code of silence he had learned in the studio system, Tony kept his diagnosis a secret until the very end. He did not become an activist. He did not make speeches. He did not reach out to the community. He retreated behind the walls of his home, protected by the fierce loyalty of Barry. He checked into hospitals under pseudonyms, terrified that the tabloids would find out the truth and strip away the dignity he had fought so hard to maintain. He didn't want to be remembered as a victim of the gay plague. He wanted to be remembered as a father and a husband. When he died on September 12, 1992, he took his secrets with him, a man who had played a monster to applause but lived as a human being in fear. He had spent his entire adult life running from Norman Bates, only to die in a room with the shades drawn, hiding from a world that had never truly allowed him to be Anthony Perkins. While Anthony Perkins was retreating into the shadows of his own psyche, Tab Hunter was facing a different kind of extinction. The 1960s arrived like a hurricane, tearing the roof off the Hollywood studio system. The culture shifted violently overnight. The audience that had once swooned over the wholesome, clean-cut, all-American boy was now listening to the Beatles, protesting the Vietnam War, and lining up to see counterculture anti-heroes like Dennis Hopper and Jack Nicholson. The dreamboat was no longer just out of fashion, he was obsolete. Warner Brothers, the studio that had manufactured Tab Hunter, saw the writing on the wall. They realized that his specific brand of innocence was now a liability in a cynical world. In a final humiliating bureaucratic act, they bought out his contract. The golden handcuffs were removed, but so was the safety net. Tab Hunter was free, but he was also unemployed and irrelevant at the age of 30. The descent was brutal. The phone, which had rung incessantly for a decade, simply stopped. The scripts that arrived were no longer for A-list features, but for B-movies, guest spots on television game shows, and eventually the dreaded dinner theater circuit. Tab found himself traveling to the Midwest to perform in plays for audiences who were more interested in their buffet meals than the aging heartthrob on stage. He went to Europe to film spaghetti westerns for producers who paid him with bounce checks. He became a punchline, a relic of a bygone era, often hired only to parody his own former image. The industry that had once worshipped him now treated him with a polite, condescending pity. He was a man who had flown too close to the sun and had fallen back to earth, burned and forgotten. Yet, in this professional wilderness, something remarkable happened. Arthur Kelm began to re-emerge from the wreckage of Tab Hunter. Without the studio publicist dictating his every move, and without the pressure to maintain the illusion of being America's boyfriend, the fear began to dissipate. He realized that the worst thing that could happen, the loss of his stardom, had already happened, and he was still standing. He stopped chasing the spotlight and turned his attention to the one passion that had never betrayed him: horses. He spent his dwindling fortune not on maintaining a Hollywood lifestyle, but on a ranch. The stables became his church. Animals did not care about box office receipts or rumors in Confidential magazine. They responded only to kindness and competence. In the sweat and dirt of the riding ring, Tab found a dignity that MGM and Warner Brothers could never manufacture. Then, in 1983, the second act of his life truly began. He met Alan Glazer, a young producer, at the Fox studio lot. The connection was grounded, pragmatic, and devoid of the hysterical neuroticism that had defined his relationship with Anthony Perkins. Alan did not want to fix Tab, nor did he want to compete with him. He simply wanted to build a life with him. They became partners in every sense of the word, forging a relationship that would last for 35 years. Alan recognized the value in Tab's legacy even when Tab himself did not. He encouraged Tab to embrace his past, to stop hiding, and to take ownership of his story. It was Alan who eventually convinced Tab to write his memoir. For decades, Tab had resisted. The code of the 1950s, deny, 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 was hardwired into his DNA. But as he watched the world change, as he saw a new generation of gay men living openly, he realized that his silence was no longer a shield. It was a burden. In 2005, with the publication of Tab Hunter Confidential, the final wall came down. He confirmed the rumors. He spoke about Tony. He dismantled the dreamboat myth with his own hands. The public reaction was not the revulsion he had feared for 50 years, but a wave of embrace. He was not rejected for being gay. He was celebrated for being honest. Tab Hunter had lost the career of a movie star, but he had won the life of a happy man, proving that the only way to survive the Hollywood machine was to stop being a product and start being a person. The story of Anthony Perkins and Tab Hunter concludes without a dramatic reunion under the spotlight. Instead, it offers a quiet final act of grace in a darkened room. In the early 1990s, as the virus ravaged Tony's body, the icy silence that had separated the two men for decades finally thawed. Tab Hunter, hearing that his former lover was fading, made the decision to reach out. He visited Tony. The details of that meeting remain private, guarded by the sanctity of the deathbed, but the significance is monumental. The Golden Boy and the Prince of Angst, now two older men, stripped of their studio contracts, their beauty faded by time and illness, sat together one last time. In that room, the rivalry of fear strikes out, and the betrayals of 1957 dissolved. All that remained were two survivors of a brutal system, acknowledging the shared history that only they could truly understand. They had both been soldiers in the same war. One had escaped, and the other was about to become a casualty. When Anthony Perkins died on September 12, 1992, he took the era of the studio closet with him into the grave. His death was a tragedy compounded by silence. Even in his obituary, the truth of his life was obscured by the fiction of his public image. He died as he had lived, protecting the brand at the cost of the man. For Tab, the loss was a catalyst. It reinforced the terrifying brevity of life. He realized that if he did not tell his own story, the studios would tell it for him forever. He refused to let the manufactured Tab Hunter be the only version of himself that history would remember. In 2005, Tab Hunter stepped into the light. With the publication of his memoir, Tab Hunter Confidential, and the subsequent documentary, he dismantled the machine that had built him. He spoke with a candor that stunned Hollywood. He confirmed the affair with Tony. He detailed the machinations of Henry Wilson. He laid bare the mechanics of the beard dates and the staged photo shoots. He did not speak with bitterness, but with a profound sense of relief. He essentially told the world, the boy you fell in love with was a lie, but the man telling you this is real. The backlash he had feared for 50 years never materialized. Instead, he was embraced by a new generation who saw him not as a fallen idol, but as a pioneer who had endured the unendurable. Tab Hunter lived his final years as a beloved elder statesman of the LGBTQ+ community, finally free to hold hands with his partner Alan in the daylight. The legacy of Anthony Perkins and Tab Hunter is far greater than their filmographies. Their story serves as a permanent indictment of the manufactured boyfriend industry. It forces us to look at the gleaming images of Hollywood stardom and see the human wreckage underneath. The studio system of the 1950s took two young men and turned them into commodities. It sold their smiles, their bodies, and their simulated heterosexuality to millions of ticket buyers, while ruthlessly suppressing their capacity to love. It demanded that they kill their authentic selves to keep the fantasy alive. Today, the studios still manufacture stars, but the story of Tony and Tab stands as a warning monument. It reminds us that the price of fame should never be the forfeiture of one's soul. As the credits roll on their lives, we are left with the image not of the movie stars, but of the two young men by the pool at the Chateau Marmont in 1956. Before the fear, before the betrayal, and before the silence, two men who found a brief shining moment of truth in a town built entirely on lies. The movies they made will eventually fade, but the courage it took to find each other in the dark remains their most enduring performance.